Now, the Brand Africa conference, well, effectively an annual event that dishes out some really important information in terms of global brands and other brands and where they are at in the African continental space. Let's find out more about what's just happened this time around with the man who's conceptualized the entire idea, my good friend Thebe Ikalafeng. Thebe, good chatting to you.
Good chatting to you, Ashraf, and good morning.
Good morning indeed. Right, so first of all, just give us an overview. Brand Africa, what is it?
Well, Brand Africa was established a decade ago, and the purpose really was to mobilize Africans to celebrate excellence that's coming out of this continent. It was about creating a positive image of this continent, driving its competitiveness, as well as celebrating the diversity of this continent. That's what we started. And then we decided a year later to establish Brand Africa 100, Africa's best brands. And the reason was we wanted to celebrate, we wanted to get to create a metric to be able to measure how well we are doing in building great brands in the continent. And the reason we did that was an understanding that when you're building great brands, you are creating great companies. Because behind every great brand is a great company. And that company creates jobs. And those jobs help to create the tax base, and the tax base helps to contribute towards our public goods for the continent. That's why we started 10 years ago.
Okay, and that metric that you've now created, so in the past, I would have to assume that a certain brand is Africa's most admired brand. Now you're saying with the metric, you can tell me, right?
Well, I can tell you because I didn't want to be subjective about it. I wanted to create something more objective that is also independent, that is also uses the global standards in terms of how to do this. So we do a Pan-African research covering 27 countries. Those countries account for 85% of the GDP as well as 85% of the population of the continent. So it's a pretty comprehensive. And the reason we do it by mobile is because mobile is the quickest way to get your answers, but also it's the most penetrative device across the continent. So that's why we do it.
What gets fed into that metric? I mean, what are the type of questions you ask?
We've narrowed down the questions so that we are really able to get to just the answer. And the most important question we ask is, what is your most admired brand? What is your most admired African brand? What's your most admired financial brand? What's your most admired media brand? And we narrowed it down to those few questions. And the reason is we wanted to understand when you say just what's your most admired brand, and we'll ask them to give us three. And they'll give us three brands. And generally what we found out is that if you just ask that question, you just get a whole universe of answers. But if you then ask them a specific question, what is your most admired African brand? Then you get closer to what are those brands that they perceive to be African. I mean, we had some interesting discoveries this year. African brand, the number one non-African brand that's perceived to be African was Coca-Cola. You get Coca-Cola, the Toyotas, the Nikes are making up those lists. But up this entire survey that's done across the continent, we get about, and by the way, the countries we survey represent pretty much every economic region in the continent, from the North Africa, East Africa, West Central. So it's pretty comprehensive in that way. And out of that comes out 15,000 brand mentions, over 15,000, and 15,000 brand mentions, and we narrow them down to individual mentions, and we get about 2,000 to 3,000 individual mentions. And out of those individual mentions, we now have to create a weighted average score, which Kantar does. The survey is collected by Geopol out of the US. They've got the biggest coverage of Africans with mobiles in the continent. And then Kantar takes that information, reduces it into a score, and the score then ranks it. The reason we do a score is we want to make sure that it's a weighted average score, that we are not overcounting Nigeria, which has got 200 million people, or undercounting Botswana, which has got only 1.5 to 2 million people. And we reduce that to the top 100.
Okay, so I'm going to go through that, some of those key names that prop up in a moment, but let's start at the end. The credibility, therefore, of the scorecard, credibility, particularly to the brands. How much weight does it carry? Well,
it's quite. The credibility of this is First and foremost, there's tenure. It's been going on for 10 years. So the second thing is that it is representative, that it covers the continent. The third most important one is that it is independent. It's not a couple of people in Joburg who sit around the table and come up with these rankings. So that's why we've got Kanta and Geopol. And then I think the fourth most important one is that you cannot get yourself to be ranked. So you cannot pay for it. So you cannot influence it.
Okay, but
so to me, those are the four perhaps most important attributes of what makes this a really good.
And when these brands get mentioned in whichever order of priority listing, do these big companies make a hoo-ha about it? So when you say company A is number one, what do they do about those results?
Well, I mean, first off, when you Google, you'll see them reported everywhere else. Everywhere else from the rest of the world, you see the reports are there. So from a coverage perspective, you can see that from a coverage, they are widely covered. They receive a certificate and they put it up proudly in their offices. And a lot of times those who didn't make it want to know, why didn't we make it? That's when we have to explain to them that you didn't make it because the person who pays the bill is called the consumer, and they didn't quite rank you as well. So yes, no, they're well recognized. I mean, last week, I think some of ads to celebrate it. Some of them take out further press releases to celebrate.
Okay, and that's clearly what you want. I mean, because by celebrating it, it obviously adds value to Brand Africa in terms of what you're achieving, but then adds the gravitas to what you've always wanted to do, which is celebrate African success, right?
Indeed. I mean, because if nobody talks about them, if nobody looks forward to them, there's a problem. So last week we launched them on Africa Day, as you know. We always launch the results on Africa Day, and the reason we launch on Africa Day or around Africa Day is really to tie them to the broader African agenda. And now with the free trade agreement that's coming into play, we are going to begin to need to see those many brands which are crossing borders coming from different parts of the continent. And last week when we launched it, we had over 3,000 views because we zoomed it and then streamed it into YouTube. Over 3,000 views on YouTube. So I think that's quite, and then there was a lot of interactions in terms of our comments and all those, and a lot of people querying why didn't I make it and all. What we never have controversy.
Okay, just a case of who's missing out. So okay, let's get through that. So that if I understand you correctly, one is the most admired brand in Africa, which suggests that it doesn't have to be an African brand, but that's the overall most admired brand or brands in the continent. So maybe give me the top 10.
This year you had Nike again as the number one. I'm just gonna open the list so I can get you the list, because Ashraf, you don't expect me at my age to know all the lists on top of my head.
I do expect you to remember Nike, considering you were the marketing manager for Nike, certainly on the continent for a long time.
I think that's the only reason they're winning, because I was marketing director there for so long. Ashraf, the top 10 on Nike number one again for the third year in a row. I mean, if you think about 10 years ago when we started the rankings, they were number 9, and they've consistently grown, maintained their dominance on the list. And very simple reason, people ask me, I said, very simple reason. They are very much in step with from not only just from a design, from an innovation, but also in terms of the temper of the country and the world. I mean, you saw they supported they've supported people like Caster Semenya. They were right there when Eliud Kipchoge broke the sub 2 miles. They were making collaborations with people, WizKid in Nigeria, and Nigeria's national team. So they are right present in the continent. Adidas, man, if you're not wearing a Nike boot, then you're wearing an Adidas boot if you're in football, and football is a religion in the continent. So Adidas at number 2. Samsung, there's a Samsung in every single country in the continent. I think I've told this story many times of my discussions with the CEO there, and he said and he says, you know what, we understand what Africans need, and we've created brands and products that speak to their specific conditions. Coca-Cola has been in the top 5 for all 10 years of the survey. It's an African brand, for lack of, and Coca-Cola, as I've said, was also top of the list of the brands. When we asked them the question, what is your most admired African brand? Coca-Cola was top of the list of the non-African brands. So quite interesting. Techno is not even sold in China, but it's everywhere in the continent. And they've just announced coming to South Africa now, for example, as well. Apple is Apple. Apple number 7. MTN. MTN is the first African brand on the list. Always is. And Africa, MTN obviously 6. And number 8 is Puma. And Puma's always been on the list as well. And then interesting, Gucci.
Okay, wow.
Now you say there's only one Gucci shop in the continent, in Joburg. But if you watch rap music, you watch music, you like the rap stars, they're all wearing Gucci. And if you go through the continent, as I have, having been to every country in the continent, I see Gucci's everywhere. Most of them are fake, but they're there, because it's an aspirational brand that the consumers in the continent would love to get their hands on. And remember, the survey is a preference survey, not a presence survey. So and Gucci's always been a list, and then Airtel. Airtel is consolidating its position in the continent. Okay. Those are the top 10.
So interesting. Out of that, yeah. I mean, so and that last point you made about preference as opposed to presence, it doesn't always mean that these most admired brands translates into sales. It could well be the case, but doesn't always mean that, right?
Doesn't always mean that. It may just say. So, for example, Alibaba is not in the continent. All Alibaba does in the continent, they sponsor an innovation prize out of Kenya and elsewhere. And as you remember, Jack Ma has been very ever present during COVID, donating PEPs and all those. So sometimes what it says, it just says, we admire what they do. We love how they go about their business. So that's what it is. So that's why it's an admiration score. And it's a preference or an admiration score, not necessarily a sales score. So of course, I mean, you'd love it. You'd love preference to lead to sales, but you must first be prepared.
Okay, now that's 10 of the 100 most admired brands. You have a separate listing for the most admired African-only brands. I mean, these are made in Africa brands, right? So who are they? The top 10.
So when you switch the question to what are the most admired African brands, quite interesting. When you don't prompt you, M10 is the number 1 brand. But when we prompt you and ask you the question, Dangote is the number 1 brand, and M10 is number 2. But I think it must be because Dangote there's an association with the person in the face. That people that we know, we read a lot. So him on his own carries a lot of the equity that then is transferred onto the brand. Then of course MTN, DSTV connects all of us. Ambessa, you find it mostly there, East Africa, North Africa. It's a European brand. Then you've got Azam, East African. They've got television. They've got products. They've got everything. So Azam and Dangote are those industrial brands out of the continent. Glow out of Nigeria, and 1 or 2 other countries that side. Ethiopian Airlines out of interest, but Ethiopian Airlines, remember, is an African airline. Then you've got Vodacom itself. So what we also did, we allowed them to separate the brand. Even though we know Vodacom is now owned by Vodafone, we allowed the response as we got it. And then ShopRite, and then number 10 is Innocent. And Innocent is a vehicle company out of Nigeria, but it's in many other countries in the continent. And their mission is to get rid of all second-hand cars out of coming into the continent and to create a market for themselves.
Now, what are the critics, and I picked up certainly on social media after the results were released last week, once again to say the most admired African brand is Nike. I mean, doesn't make sense. And only 10 or so, roughly, out of 100 of the most admired brands on the continent are African brands. What does that say about, does it say much about the consumer, or does it say much about the level of industrialization and brand marketing and penetration for African brands in the continent?
Well, it speaks to two things. If you see this list, this year, only 13% of the top 100 brands are African. So that's a problem. So it means 87% of the brands that Africans admire are non-African. What it speaks to two areas. On the one hand, it speaks to the consumer. It says that the consumer, I'm not sure if they have a poor self-image as Africans. I don't know if that's how to put it, or they have no confidence in African brands. But on the other side, it speaks to the entrepreneur. Do they not have the confidence to create and to challenge brands, or do we not have the resources to do that, or do we not have the experience? So those are the challenges that we face as a country.
I just want to end up by talking about Nike once again, because they are the number one most admired brand in Africa. You spoke about the causes and their willingness to take a stand on a range of issues that you rattled off. What you didn't rattle off is very topical right now, again taking a stand against the issue of racism, like don't do it, right, in this case here, or just do it, stop racism. As someone who's understood brands for a long time, Thebe, your side, how important is that a brand that's actually good in the apparel space gets involved into social consciousness? How important is it? How risky is it?
Remember, the brand exists as a result of the consumer preferring it. So sometimes it depends on the relationship you've built with your brand over the years in terms of what type of a brand are you? Are you a brand that is just a functional brand, or your brand that's involved in their lives? Now, remember, the brand Nike has always been about self-expression as well. Just do it. It's been a motivating brand. So they can't ask you to just go do it in the context of how the country is going. So that's why whether it's Colin Kaepernick or somebody else, they've always, or as Tiger Woods, whom they've stood by for years. So a brand like Nike has said, we exist as a license out of society. And if we get this license from society, from time to time, there comes an issue or two which requires us to take a stand as a brand. And that stand does not necessarily change who we are, but it aligns us with those who keep us in business.
So that's an interesting point. One is they impact society by the goods that they manufacture, that you and I wear, but at the same time, they also impact society by them pushing a certain narrative that maybe is reflective of in this case, say, social justice issues, right? Why do you think they get it right then?
I think they get it right because Nike's always been able to find that balance. Because I think what they do is they go to the core, to the essence of who are we and what is the society that we support. Who are they and what matters? They get it right because they say what matters. They don't necessarily. I'm not sure that Nike is taking a political stance. I think what Nike, and I remember during my days at Nike, what then I can't remember, Liz Dolan, I think was the name, the marketing director then used to say, they said, we need to get into the hearts and minds have spoken about their sport. I right to get into their hearts and minds and their souls and understand what matters, how are they feeling, so that when you reflect, your brand should reflect who they are. Because you know what a brand is? A brand is a membership, a brand is an affiliation, is an association. So if I say I'm a Nike guy, it means personality, the spirit of who I am. So when I speak, when Nike speaks, it has to speak in that
lastly, I'm pretty certain that every time you get the results of the survey, some of the information jumps off the page that even surprises you. What has surprised you this time around?
Well, I mean, I think to start with, what we've done differently this year out of interest is over and above doing the global launch, we then decided, let us scale it down to countries. So now I'm on the road show to the country. So I'm not digging down and say, what is the country list? And last week we started with Namibia. And when we launched Namibia, what was absolutely floored me was that the two of the top three brands are local brands we've never heard of.
Okay.
When I spoke to the people in Namibia, they said those are the brands. And those are like hip hop brands there for the continent to create strong local brands which in the future which lead the continent.
Okay.
I think what continuously surprises me about this list is the consistency of it, but also it's also what consistency is not in a positive way, because it means we are not creating those new brands. I mean, the fact that year in and year out, it's MTN, it's Dangote, it's all those brands says we need a bit of competition in the continent, and there is not much competition that's coming through, particularly from a local brand. I think what is quite interesting is how the global brands really dig in. They dig in because they spend the money, they spend the time, they spend the experience.
Okay, just lastly, how many countries on this continent have you visited, Thebe Ikalafeng himself?
I've been to every country in the continent. So that's given me a bit of an insight. So when a better insight now that when I see the results, I can relate a little bit more to the results than I thought. And now I have a bit of a insider advantage.
So you have been to. Okay, so you've been to every single one of the 50 plus countries on this continent.
I've been to every single one of the 54 countries, and if you look at the AU counting, it's 55. So from Western Sahara to which is the disputed territory of Morocco, to the newest democracy, which is South Sudan, to Eritrea, which this agreement with Ethiopia. To open up the borders, to make peace since the war of 1991, to Somalia, right in Mogadishu, which I was there, I think a week after the bombs where they wiped out, all the way to Libya, to Tripoli. I was in Tripoli perhaps a month or so, well, maybe a few weeks or a month before all the other airports. I was already arrived into an airport which was bombed in Tripoli. But every single country has surprised me. But every country collectively put together, they show the resilience of the continent, the continent's ability to renew and to be resourceful. And
okay.
What is our diversity.
All right, I'm going to suggest people follow you in particular on Instagram, because that's when you document your stories. That's why I titled you Mr. Africa. But you have a specific hashtag you use, right? Or with regard to African stories. What is that hashtag?
Generally when I travel, but I'm also not. So I'm back traveling now. But now I'm traveling on the digital.
But you still do Africa. So Thebe travels Africa. Thebe, good chatting to you. Thanks for your time. Me, Preetesh Sewraj, the newly appointed CEO of the Loeries, because they've made some important decisions as a direct result of COVID-19. Preetesh, good chatting to you. Big responsibility, new job, new decisions. Tell me about that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ashraf. Yeah, it's an interesting time, and especially an interesting time to start a new job. But one of the things that I'm seeing in this role is that people within advertising and brand communication are doing a lot to actually prop up society at this stage. If you look at ads that are coming out, but they're also struggling, and they're very vulnerable with agencies under a lot of pressure. So one of the things that I've decided to do at the Loeries is to make entries free, and that's never happened before. So the first time in our history, entries are going to be free, and considering we're a non-profit organization, it was a pretty big decision to take.
So what would be the rationale behind it? I mean, is it because they don't have the money and therefore you making it free, or what?
Yeah, I think it's what we looked at is you have to ask yourself, what is the profit motive of any organization? And globally there's a lot of different awards, and their profit motivation is the dollars, the pounds, the euros. But the Loeries being a non-profit, our motivation is support of the brand communication and advertising industry across Africa and the Middle East. So the reason we decided to make it free is because if agencies are already struggling, if individuals are struggling, let's not put financial burden on them in terms of getting that great content in. This is a year where we need to unearth some amazing ideas and thinking that have gone into supporting society during this pandemic. And so by making the entries free, we'll allow the best stories to come out and the best stories to rise to the front as a learning for society at large.
What would an entry normally cost typically?
Yeah, roughly around, anywhere from about 900 rands to about 3,500 rands, depending on the category. And all of this, every single cent that we would normally receive goes into supporting the industry anyway. So if you look at it, even by taking away entries in this period, we're still supporting the industry, albeit in a different way. But that's what we're doing to support them.
So what would be the cost to the Loeries of losing that revenue?
Significant. As a nonprofit said, our financials are out there and open, but we're literally giving up millions and millions of rands in revenue that would normally be used for a number of different initiatives, everything from our Creative Future scholarships to the Creative Week, to lots of different initiatives that we actually do. But as I said, we give up that revenue, but in exchange, what we're doing is we're finding other ways to prop up the industry.
Of course, the other way to do it is to charge them, assuming most of them can, in fact, afford to pay, and then use that revenue and ring fence it for a very specific COVID-19 related project.
Yes, so the strange thing is that would make perfect sense if there wasn't so much a challenge right now, but what we're seeing is there's many agencies that are losing potentially 25% of their income, and at any given time, the stats that we have say that they generally have about 2 months worth of working capital to go. So we're looking at a situation where potentially a lot of agencies may have to let go of staff to stay afloat and stay alive during this time. So instead of putting additional burden on agencies, I think the best thing to do is to support them across the board, regardless of size.
So let me get this right. Are you saying if those 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 rand per entry, if that was not forgo from your side, that you genuinely would get agencies not entering because they are cash struck at this point in time?
Well, it's an interesting debate. We probably would have got quite a few entries, but I think where the challenge would come is those agencies and brands that are distressed at this time, that are struggling and that are having to make really difficult decisions, they would have been the entries that we would have lost. And there should be some really good stories there. So we don't want to lose the stories, because that's what we're about, right? The Loeries is all about having the best stories. So making entries free, yeah. So we give up just a portion of our entries, but in exchange, we get the best stories from this time.
What has been the reaction from the agencies?
Overwhelmingly supportive across Africa and the Middle East. I think, as I said, this has never been done before. They have the budgets. A lot of them are very appreciative. I've spoken to large agency heads who went, we don't enter any other awards anywhere else in the world. They're not entering awards anywhere else in the world, but they're going to enter Loeries, and if they win, they're going to support it and do everything that they can. So we're having these big discussions across the region.
So how important then is the Loeries as an entity in terms of its relevance to the advertising industry in South Africa, in Africa, and the Middle East?
Yeah, I'll take it back to when I took this job. When I took this job, I had this idea of the Loeries being this massive organization and having this huge amount of respect. And even I couldn't imagine just how much respect and love there is for Loeries across the region, purely because, in terms of the work that's happening and the work that the Loeries does, it helps unearth not just the great stories, but the great individuals behind it. It recognizes and supports a creative ecosystem that's so important to prop society up. And across Africa and the Middle East, from South Africa to Nigeria to Kenya to Turkey to the UAE, all of these countries, we are speaking to agency heads. And what we're seeing is that this year, as we make entries free, they're supporting us, and there's still support going forward for anything else that we have to do in the future. So it's still an important organization in the region.
Why did you take the job?
I think I needed a new challenge. The previous organization I'd been at, I'd sold my stake to a large multinational advertising agency, been there for a few years, and there was time for an exciting challenge. And when the Loeries approached me, it just seemed like a logical fit. And I wanted a challenge, and without a doubt, I think I got the biggest challenge I possibly could imagine.
Okay, so they knocked on your door, you didn't knock on their door, now we know, right?
I was lucky. Yeah, I was lucky. They came to me and they said, "Hey, will you consider this?"
Okay, I understand there are two other projects around COVID-19 that Loeries has set up, right? Maybe social responsibility projects. Just tell us about that very quickly.
Yeah, so there's numbers. So the first one that we started was called Wake the Nation, which was taking creative ideas that we can get from the creative industry and figure out how to solve problems, be it problems of transport, loneliness. There's so many problems that COVID's brought in as a knock-on effect. So we've unearthed that and working with really good brands to bring that to life. So that's called Wake the Nation, and that's found at wakethenation.org.za. And then the other one we're doing is we've just launched the Loeries Creative Hour, which is to ensure that the creative industry stays up to date with the latest developments, the latest thinkings, and we're doing that every single week. And that's just the start. I mean, we're working on a lot of different education plans, and as time goes by, you'll see a lot more programs coming out from the Loeries.
And what does that creative hour entail? What does it mean?
So what happens is we normally have the Loeries Creative Week once a year, and knowing the challenges that the industry needs support right now, we launch a weekly creative hour, and where we bring advertising heads, people who are working in transformation, just interesting people. As an example, next week we have the South African ambassador to Nigeria who's going to be on the show. Tomorrow we've got Grant Leck and Pepe Mere from Joe Public. So we get a diverse group of people who are touching the advertising industry and impacting it to speak to us and ensure that there's information that helps support and keeps people motivated in this tough time.
And here's the last thing. Has being in lockdown, not just in South Africa, but in many parts of the world, to what degree has that helped creativity in terms of finding solutions through marketing and advertising, or has it hindered it?
No, I think it's helped it. I think one of the interesting things is, I speak to a lot of people in the creative industry. I'm not a creative. I'm just supporting this industry. And therefore, when I look at it, and you won't see a single news article or anything online about the amazing work that the creatives are doing in the stage. And really what's happening is, if you look at the major funds that are out there, or just trying to figure out what to buy in the grocery store, or even some of the messaging coming out from government, all of this communication exists because the creative industry has found a way to work from home, to support society, to make all of this a reality in a time when society needs creativity and advertising and branding at the most.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's leave it at that. I'm going to take a closer look at creative communications in a COVID-19 world, maybe far more than I've done up to now. Preetesh, good chatting to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Ashraf.
With me is the MD for Brand Finance Africa, my good friend Jeremy Sampson. Always has lots to say around the field of branding and marketing. Jeremy, good talking to you once again.
Ashraf, always good to you. And let's get it out there. Happy birthday.
Well, there
today.
you are. I expected you to say a thing like that. Let's talk about other anniversaries of sorts from a whole lot of brands in terms of where they are. Now your organization, the Brand Finance, puts out a series of reports, right? Quite a few throughout the year. There's been a few that you put out recently. Tell me about, let's talk about them firstly. Which one you want to talk about? Cosmetics, I understand, in hotels in particular.
That's right. Just to take a step back, Brand Finance is a PLC. It's based in London, in the City of London. It's been around 25 years or so. It was a breakaway from my old company, into Brand Sampson. And Brand Finance today is in about 20 countries. But as you say, one of the things they do from the end of January is start produce rankings of the top brands in the world. 2 days later, the top banks in the world. And so it's a whole series of rankings that runs right through until about September of categories, segments, and countries, comparing nation brands. You say, just in the last 10 days, one has come out on cosmetics. A couple of weeks ago, one was on apparel, and Nike was the top brand there. Cosmetics, L'Oreal is the top brand. So we have a stream of them coming out. And we're hoping to put out our rankings of the top South African brands, which we'll be doing with Brand South Africa, as we've done for the last few years. And we're hoping that will happen on July the 8th. Obviously, at the moment, with the impact of COVID-19, everything is a bit of a movable feast. For the most part, that's our plan. So we'll be coming out it's South Africa's top 50 yet again.
Okay, and these rankings, two things there. A, how much currency do these rankings have? And B, you can tell me about how you go about getting the rankings right in the first place, the formula.
Right, good question. Well, the first thing is that there is an international standards, and the ISO issues standards for both brand valuation, that's the financial value of a brand, and the brand equity, that's more the brand strength of the brand. And in fact, a new ISO on the equity side. Brand value, the ISO has been out for some years, and brand finance is one of only a handful of companies that complies with that. So when we put out a value, it's ISO accredited. Everything is signed off in London by the top team there. And basically, when people look at the value of a brand, you can see who's moving up, who's moving down, what are the trends, what are the impacts in certain regions or countries. And obviously, COVID-19, since the end of January, has had more impact on some categories than others. And it's very interesting how COVID has, as we know, decimated airlines, decimated hotels and tourism generally. But then there are some sectors, of which cosmetics is one, apparel is another, that have kept going reasonably strongly. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they go. Obviously, the tech brands like Amazon has done incredibly well because of all of its deliveries and because it's tech-based. And that's where we're finding generally that tech-based brands are doing incredibly well. It's interesting that, Ashraf, about a year ago, if we talked about top brands, we'd have probably never mentioned Zoom. And Zoom has come to us, here we are talking on Skype, but we could be on Team or Zoom or even FaceTime. There are so many different things. And I think it's almost one of the hottest shares, is it the New York Stock Exchange or wherever it's ranked, that Zoom has gone up through the roof because it's just so potent and so relevant today. And I think, as we're saying, the world is changing, the world has changed, but it'll be different tonight from it is this morning. And one of the things is we're doing all these things technically and talking to each other technically and face-to-face. So who needs to have a face-to-face meeting anymore? It'd be nice to have a cup of coffee. But that's the past almost, and
we certainly do miss it, and hopefully that will come up pretty soon, right? So, okay, let's talk about the hotel industry then, in terms of the shifts that have happened as per your latest, scoreboard, right? Run through that.
I haven't got the scores in front of me, but it's people are the ones that are the strongest, and they have so many sub-brands sometimes as well, so they cater for different segments of the population. Sometimes, of course, those major brands have acquired other brands in different geographies, and they don't always rebadge themselves as, shall we say, a Marriott or a Hilton, but they have been really decimated, and I know that a lot of them are having huge difficulties. There's a lot of talk about how many of them will survive. And of course, it's a very complicated industry because when, for instance, you see the chief executive of Marriott, who has been taking a huge leadership role. And I have to say, watching him on Twitter and YouTube, he's taken a fantastic role. But it's very noticeable that he doesn't look a healthy man. And it transpires that he's just been through, as you're nodding away, you obviously know, a cancer scare. But he's still there, and he's still in charge, and he's showing huge leadership. But he explains that sometimes, for instance, the properties that hotels are housed in are not owned by the hotel. So the risk factor isn't as great as it might be, and that risk is spread amongst the different stakeholders, if I can call them that, from the property owners to the license holders and then to the management teams. So it's a very complex area, but I think the bigger boys will survive, obviously. I know in South Africa there's a lot of talk about City Lodge. Will it have deep enough pockets to survive at the moment? And I think a lot of people hope so, because I know people who stay at it rave about it. But that's, I'm afraid, one of the unintended consequences of the times we live in, that despite being well revered and well regarded, simply put,
And are
they
there
will not
brands
survive.
in the hotel space, where the overall space has plummeted? We understand that, but are there brands that incredibly appear to have bucked the trend? Is there something like that?
I don't think there is a single example of that because, hotels, when you think about it, is it tourism? Well, tourism has virtually stopped. Is it conferences? Conferences have definitely stopped. Is it gambling? And that, for the most part, has stopped. I seem to recall reading about 10 days ago that in Macau, and of course Macau is the biggest gambling center of the world, much bigger than Las Vegas, Macau has started gambling again. But sporting events, for instance, a lot of hotels, certainly in the UK, are linked to sporting arenas, as I think is at Manchester United or Manchester City's ground, and obviously positioned there to take advantage of sport. So all these things basically have stopped. Most hotels are only housing sometimes frontline workers or hospital workers. I know in New York City, that's what some of the hotels are doing. They're looking after people in the front line who are away from home and need local accommodation. And of course, there is no other local accommodation. There's no Airbnb, there are no guest houses. So some of those biggest hotels are using sections to look after people in need at the moment.
Okay, well, and let's talk cosmetics then. Let's talk about the cosmetic industry.
Cosmetics is one of those sectors that's actually still doing very well. Whether you use hand cream or shampoo, and we used to say the ladies use their fragrances, but I know a lot of guys use their fragrances and deodorants and things now as well. So that goes on, and these are fairly small ticket items. They're not that expensive, and whether you have them delivered over the last couple of months or now you can go out to a Clicks or a Discount and buy them. So those brands are carrying on. The big, strongest brand is L'Oreal, the French brand, which is by far the biggest. But it's then interesting when you look at Gillette, and people are joking, how's Gillette doing at the moment? I notice you're shaving, but in my case, I'm not shaving, and a lot of people aren't shaving, so perhaps Gillette's figures are going down a bit. And then Nivea is the third brand, and Nivea, a lot of people don't realize, if I said to you, which country does Nivea come from? A lot of people don't realize it's actually German. So you have L'Oreal, French, Gillette, which is part of Procter & Gamble now, American, and Nivea is in third place. Interesting as an aside as well that a lot of people forget that the Body Shop, which of course Anita Roddick started years ago, and a lot of people still regard very highly because of its ethical approach to life. And as an aside, people might not remember that a former chief executive, and I'm trying to recall his name, who worked at Edgar's, became the chief executive of, in fact, the Body Shop for a time. But then L'Oreal bought the Body Shop some years ago. But then L'Oreal had a bit of a scandal because it was found that they still used animals for testing of various things. And that didn't fit very well with, obviously, the Body Shop when it became public domain. So the Body Shop was sold in about 2017 by L'Oreal to a group called Natura. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but I certainly hadn't. And in fact, it's from Brazil.
Okay.
So Body Shop might be a surprise to a lot of people. But this is an example of a brand still carrying on, still being high regarded. After all, do you worry that a Jaguar is made by Tata today or a Land Rover? So in the case of Body Shop, which of course in South Africa is handled through the Clicks group, it's actually ultimately owned by the Brazilians.
Well, now we know, isn't it? Yeah. I suppose it also says, in terms of the shifts you've just given, how COVID-19 has impacted on restraining certain industries, but also provided a catalyst for others. I think the issue around cleanliness is uppermost amongst that, and therefore a spike for the right reasons in those industries. Let's then talk very quickly about brands that seem, in terms of their brand communication, they've got it spot on in embracing the realities of COVID-19 and other ethical issues in the last few weeks?
I think in South Africa, I have to scratch my head to think, and I don't know if you have any thoughts, but in South Africa, I haven't seen anyone taking a really strong stand. Whereas in the States, I think some companies like Starbucks have deliberately played a role. People have publicly talked about senior executives taking pay cuts. I know in South Africa that Pick n Pay has done that. Some of them have, they're working below the radar, if I can call it that. They don't want to shout it from the houses. I find it very interesting how we've had COVID-19, but if you're watching international television today, it's all about racism and about the riots. And it's really absolutely terrible what we're seeing from the incident last week, which, let's face it, was, whether it's homicide 1, 2, or 3, it was plain murder. And then you see a brand like Nike gently putting out a television ad, which Wieden and King did last, Thursday or so, saying, just don't do it. And to me, that is very, very powerful. It's even more powerful when you hear that the arch enemy of Nike, Adidas, actually restreamed the ad as well in sympathy with the whole thing.
Wow.
And this to me is very, very powerful, where here is a brand that has got its finger totally on the pulse, is reacting quickly, and it's an example of an agile brand. We all know that today brands must be agile, they must be quick, they must respond, and that some of them are not. But in the case of Nike, it was spot on, and I think this is an example to all other great brands that you've got to keep your eyes wide open, finger on the pulse, and react quickly. But then you've got to get it right. You don't want to do like H&M did a little while ago and got it totally wrong. So again, as you and I know, sometimes you can do things and get them wrong. And then it would be better, in fact, if you've done nothing at all.
Well, here's the question then. So we understand the stance, the global stance against racism is a given, and Nike has done that. But are there inherent risks when a brand, in this case, yes, does embrace a global phenomenon? So they're not being selective, but are there risks attached to that? Considering that many people who may well be their market may not like the type of stance they take, and they could actually even be racist as well. We just don't know, isn't it?
You broke up a little bit there, but look, the answer is that in any advertising you do, you've got to be incredibly sensitive. No, it still amazes me today that you see people have put out ads which they've quickly had to withdraw. Now, I know it's one of the tactics of some ad agencies to put out things on a Friday night, knowing full well they'd have to withdraw it by Sunday and say, oh, sorry. But we see other people who have actually put out ads seriously thinking that these will hit the mark and make the point that they want to make, but there's such a strong reaction against them for whatever reason. It might be racial, it might be environmental or whatever. And of course, everyone has to be very aware that today, especially with social media, and especially with that you can get someone who's taking a lot of flack at the moment is Facebook, for various reasons. But Facebook is under attack from all sorts of quarters, not just one or two. They're sometimes streaming things in one country which offends the culture or the religion of that country. Sometimes putting out things which just they're not in any censoring some of the tweets that Trump is putting out, President Trump, whereas Twitter is. And Nike is being accused by a lot of people of being unethical. They're even having senior members of staff resigning because they don't want to work for a company anymore that they regard as unethical. And a lot of people think that, for instance, President Trump, through his tweets, has been, well, to be polite, insensitive, but no, rather almost inciting violence, inciting the country states. So that's where I find it interesting watching. Go on.
So here's the point: whether it's Nike or whether it's the Facebooks or the Twitters and everybody else that we speak about, apparel or even in the communication space, should these brands then should they take sides? Because Nike's done just that, isn't it? Very clearly.
Nike has done that. Nike takes a stand. Nike is never grey. It makes a stand specifically. I'm trying to remember the baseball player who kneeled when the American anthem. Yes, and at the time there was a lot of controversy, not only about him but about Nike. And Nike, basically says we will do what we think is right, and sometimes almost to hell with the consequences. And that's where I think they become seen as, one of their values is to be authentic, and I think they always are authentic. And you could add to that brave as well. But as a result of that, I think they're highly regarded. You know exactly where they stand. They're not sort of sticking their head down underneath the parapet, as it were. They're proudly standing there and they're making their mark. And to say, just don't do it, is incredibly powerful.
Okay, and that's where we're going to leave it. They've just done it, and the message is very, very clear. Jeremy, good chatting to you. I'm going to, well, thanks as always, right? And hopefully we'll have lots more chats down the line, I know that. But thanks for your time, Jeremy.